Greetings, everyone. This is Professor Brooke Hailu Besha from nahootv. Our program is Voice of the Diaspora. It's a weekly program. Thanks for being with us. Today, I have another distinguished guest, and he's also a good friend of Ethiopia. He's Dr. Lawrance Freeman from the state of Maryland, from the USA. Dear Lawrence, I would like to welcome you on behalf of myself, Nahu, as well as on behalf of the entire audience that's global. Welcome again. Good to see you.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you again.
My pleasure, Lawrence. So, Dr. Lawrence Freeman, let me say a few words, dear audience, about Dr. Lawrence Freeman. He is a distinguished scholar, an American resident of Maryland. He has been involved in doing research about African countries and African people for the last 30 years. He's a researcher, he's a writer, he's a speaker on a variety of topics concerning Africa. He's known well for his analysis on socio-economic political analysis about African governments. He has written hundreds of articles and reports on Africa. And by the way, he's also a very good, and he's knowledgeable of the African continent, north, south, west, and east. He has been to African continent for more than 25 times. He's also an academic. He teaches as an adjunct instructor on African history and African politics in the state of Maryland. He is also the vice chairman of the scientific advisory committee to the Lake Chad Basin Commission. He knows thoroughly about West Africa and the Chad Basin Commission. As well, he is involved also in economic development policy studies about Ethiopia, Mali, Sudan, Chad, Nigeria, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire. The list goes on. And I have to stop here with one other achievements of his, and that is he's a strong advocate of the Trans-Aqua, the water project, here again revolving around the Lake Chad Basin. And not only that, he is also an advocate of the African Integrated High-Speed Rail Network. He is I would say, enthusiastic. As I'm going to be asking him about that. So Dr. Freeman, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's start off with the first question, and that is with the current one, and that is, in my last interview with you several months ago, as well as about the numerous interviews that you give to globally to American, European, Ethiopian, and other TV, radio, and also interviews in the press. Given that Ethiopia is now again in a state of, I would say, state of happiness in a way. Why? Because GERD, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, has achieved 91%. On top of that, we are now right there before the rainy season. Ethiopia is going to have the fourth filling of GERD. What do you think will be its significance for Ethiopia, the Horn, and other African countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brooke. Yes, we're coming up, I guess, somewhere between June and July, we'll have the fourth filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And I think this is a major accomplishment for Ethiopia, for the Horn of Africa, and for the African continent. I was privileged to have a tour of the GERD back in December of last year. And it's a great marvel of a scientific engineering structure that made me very, very happy to be there, because it reaffirmed what I knew already, is that humankind intervenes on nature and the environment. We don't stand by and just look at it. We take action. And this is the kind of things that the human race does, is that we create a dam over a river that's been flowing for about 5 million years. Yeah. And we get electricity out of it. And
Yeah.
this is a human intervention to create a resource that Ethiopia and Africa desperately needs. And the Ethiopians have done it.
Yep.
And I believe I was told by the deputy manager of the project that they expect to be completed in 2025. When I was there were 2 turbines running, and now there's 11 more, which would bring about 5,150 megawatts of power. And I think this is an important lesson because this represents potentially a model for Africa. There's constant USAID, which benefits donations, but this, which are important from the United States in terms of food, but this is something that actually helps a country develop itself. It's a long-term infrastructure improvement that has lasting effects for the entire economy. And it was done by the Ethiopian people themselves. They entirely funded it because the IMF and World Bank wouldn't come across. And so the Ethiopian people did it themselves. So this shows, this is a beautiful demonstration of how a nation can act in a sovereign manner to determine its future economic wealth of its country. And I think all African nations should be happy. And in fact, if the West was a little bit more thoughtful, they would be issuing press statements praising the Ethiopians, because this is exactly what we want countries to do: make investments in infrastructure to improve the lives of their people. I'm sure there'll be all kinds of statements coming out as the fourth filling approaches. But overall, I think this is a very significant nodal point for Ethiopia and Africa as a whole.
Very well put. I agree with what you say. And also, I believe, if I may add, it has a symbolic significance, that things can be done, even developing countries can achieve something. On top of that, it shows the determination of the Ethiopian people. In what sense? Look, this is the fourth filling. It was all began 2011, and then the first filling was in 2020, the second 2021, 2022, and behold, now we are in the fourth filling. And every time Ethiopia is capturing, water, by raising the dam, and from the project, it's going to be operational. Now, really, it's armed. By January, February 2024, I believe it's going to be armed. So you have put it in the right perspective. Now, so when we build up, my follow-up question is, okay, God willing, we're going to complete it. Ethiopia is going to complete it, and it's going to be fully operational, as you have pointed out, in 2025. Okay, what would be its impact? Would be the next question. If you could care to give us to our audience your thoughts on that.
Well, as many of us know, the inter-African trade among the African nations is very, very low. It's estimated to be between 13 and 15% of trade is among African nations, and therefore the overwhelming majority is outside the continent. Many people constantly talking about we have to improve this. Well, this is a concrete way of doing it. Ethiopia now is already exporting electricity just based on the 2 turbines, which are operating at 375 megawatts apiece. So 750 megawatts of power have been added to Ethiopia's national grid, approximately. And this is now Ethiopia is already exporting energy to Sudan, Djibouti, and Kenya, and has more contracts and more agreements for more energy to be exported. So you're seeing what many people talk about is already happening, because you have an integration now led by Ethiopia's GERD into the rest of the Horn of Africa, which is going to increase. Because if you look at the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia is the key nation.
Great.
And even though it doesn't have the coastline along the Indian Ocean and Gulf of Eden, nevertheless, it determines the political economic policy for that region. So Ethiopia bringing forth this dam, which again is going to be the biggest injection of electricity on the continent. Now, from my standpoint, it's still not enough, but it is significant. And this will spread to all of East Africa. And this is the process of actually integrated development. And if you want to build a nation, you must have abundant access to electricity. The consumer needs it to live, and industry needs it. And you cannot build industry without power. And in fact, the wind power and solar power are not going to do the trick. You need hydropower, you need fossil fuel power, you need nuclear energy. So Ethiopia is setting the stage for not only its own access to electricity among its 50, 60 million people who don't have it, but for industry and for the entire region. This is what any sane friend of Africa wants. And this is something that we should be, the US and the West should be promoting. And other nations, I believe, will be studying this model because it is a development model, not just for the nation, but for the region. And it's already taking place. So we can expect more and more results as more and more turbines are activated and brought online.
Very true. Very true. Thank you. You know, help me out, really. I was reading something about the Lake Chad Basin Commission, which you are involved. And I want you to comment on that. And that is, well, it was formed in 1964, I believe.
Correct.
By 4 countries. You are knowledgeable about that. And that is Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. Definitely. And there were other observers that through time were added, or they were they came in, you know. I could, you know what I'm, several countries. Among them, in one report, Egypt was included. In another report, they were missing Egypt. Mind you, what brought, of course, Egypt is interested in water and anything that goes with rivers in the world. But what do you think was the reason, or what brought the Egyptians to be an observer of the Lake Chad Basin, as far as you know?
My understanding is that you also have the Central African Republic. Sudan has become part of it. Algeria, because what you're talking about is a basin.
Yes.
This basin is huge. This basin encompasses a huge area of Africa where the water will tend to flow towards the Chad, just like you have the Nile River Basin, you have the Blue Nile River Basin. And this is
Libya and Algeria were also, I think, and
yes,
DR Congo, Republic of the Brazzaville was also
right. I've not read anywhere that the Egyptians were involved. They're not certainly members of the commission, which I think the Lake Chad Basin Commission now may be 7 countries, but I've not read anywhere that the Egyptians were involved. So I didn't know that the basin extended that far into the northeast section of the continent. But the Egyptians are desperate for water, and so I can see that they would be looking for opportunities because they mainly have a dry desert with a huge aquifer underneath. But I don't really have any good intelligence on Egyptian involvement in the Lake Chad.
Okay, got you. Thank you. Just came up into my mind. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Now, there should be, and there are steps that need to be taken, I believe. There is, of course, the trilateral meeting the Egyptians have withdrawn, and literally for a year and a half, maybe going to 2 years, there's no negotiation, you know. That needs to be continued, and Ethiopia's position is very clear that Ethiopia is ready to, is already there and ready to set a date and a place, either Khartoum or Addis or Cairo or a neutral country, to continue the conversation. While Egypt has refused. That tells us that there is still on the Egyptian side a misunderstanding about that. What kinds of confidence-building measures should be built to create a win-win situation between the three countries, Ethiopia included, of course?
Well, Sudan now has, I believe, twice confirmed that the previous 3 fillings of the dam have not reduced the flow of the Nile through their country, which means that it's also not been reduced for the flow of water to reach the Aswan Dam in Egypt. So I think the empirical facts are that the filling of the dam, which was stretched out to 7 years at the request of the Egyptian and Sudanese, that the filling of the dam is not harming the number of cubic meters of water that are reaching the Aswan Dam. Egypt, in many ways, is pursuing very useful policies for their own nation. I mean, they've expanded the Suez Canal, so more traffic can flow through the canal. They're building industrial complexes or industries along the canal. They are now in the process, together with Russia, building 2 to 4 nuclear power plants in Egypt, which will supply them more energy. So there's many aspects of the Egyptian policy, which are development policy for the benefit of their people. Now they have almost complete, their population has, I think it's 98%, I'm not sure, access to electricity. So they have full access to electricity.
Correct.
They also have more use of cubic meters of water per capita than many countries, and and orders of magnitude more than Ethiopia. So, and they've diverted some of the water of the Nile to agricultural projects. So they're not suffering from a shortage of water or electricity in the present, but they nevertheless have made the constant threats, and I was reading some more this morning, that somehow Ethiopia, and they've accused Ethiopia of intentionally denying water to Egypt. Now, there's no truth in this whatsoever. And in fact, in this new book that's come out on the GERD, the author provides us a history of going back into the 1800s, where the Egyptians and the British viewed Lake Tana as a water storage area, but it was a U.S. team of the U.S. Interior Department in 1957 that mapped out possible 4 dams that could be built from the Blue Nile, and of course one of them is being built, the GERD. So the British and the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were given rights to the Nile by the Queen. They think they own the Nile and they can make these determinations. They have. My own personal view, and I'm not an expert on Egyptian politics, but my own personal view is that much of the criticism and what we would call noise coming out of Egypt may be for political consumption. Because in fact, there's nothing that the Ethiopians are doing that will prevent the flow of water. In fact, when I was visiting the dam, they're doing everything they can to continue the flow of water, even while construction is going on, while filling is going on, that you can see there's a constant flow of the Nile at the dam itself. So I think what we need to do is to work with the Egyptians to understand that development of the GERD helps them because it helps the entire region and the entire continent. For example, Sudan. I've been in Sudan many times. I've taken trips on the Nile in Khartoum, and they will now have a regulated flow. So they won't have floods, which have killed people, but they won't have these dry areas where you can't even put a boat out there.
Yeah.
They will have a regulated flow. They are getting the electricity, will get more electricity. And Egypt borders, Sudan borders on Egypt. So Egypt benefits from a stable, economically prosperous Sudan and benefits from a stable, economic, prosperous Ethiopia. The more Africans that are living at a higher standard of living, the benefit it is to its neighbors. And I think that future development policy for the Nile is a absolutely legitimate discussion. You have 10 nations in the basin with a population of about 500 million, half a billion people, a third of the continent.
Third of the continent, yes.
This is, so what are we going to do with the Nile? It's not big enough. There's only 84 billion cubic meters the last time I looked. So we have to build a second Nile, and that's going to be through desalinization. So my suggestion is to start building nuclear power plants to bring in, to desalinate, take the salt out of the water from the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and use that to actually build the equivalent of another Nile, because the Nile itself is not big enough. So we have to think in the future, the next 10 to 20 years, about how all the nations of the Nile Basin participate in development. But there is actually no objective reason for the Egyptians' criticism. And therefore, my guess is this is for internal consumption. I don't think the Egyptians would take any aggressive action, although I have seen videos, internet videos of Egyptian planes bombing, simulating the bombing of the Nile, of the GERD. I mean, this would be such a catastrophic action that Egypt would be isolated throughout the entire continent. I think they know, the Egyptian government knows it's a fait accompli, but nevertheless feels its obligation to show its people that it's protesting Ethiopia's actions, even though the GERD is on Ethiopian sovereign territory, and they've never been part of any water agreement with Egypt and Sudan in 1929 or 1959. So they have every right to do it, but they're not doing it in a harmful way. And my hope is that the Egyptians will come along and understand the positive nature of this for their country as well.
Very true. Very well said. Great points. And just to add, they have also lately started the Toshka project also in Egypt, building canals, 160, 170 kilometers long canal. Egypt, rightfully so, they have to feed their people. They have to have an accelerated economic, social development. Ethiopia is for it, I think. It's natural, it's humane. They are trying to develop the deserts of what they call the Western deserts.
Yes.
They are working hard on that. And on the northern eastern front, they are, I think, 40 kilometers, or let's say 25, 30 kilometers in the east of Al-Qahira or Cairo. They are building a new capital city, by the way, with the intention of a parliament, even the embassies and foreign diplomats moving to that new city. I mean, they are progressing, they are going ahead. And another point is, the Aswan High Dam itself and the Lake Nasser, as you know, 2/3 of it is in Egypt, about 1/3 of it is in the Sudan, Lake Nasser. I mean, there's plenty of water there for years and years to come. In Aswan Dam itself, I believe 160 billion cubic meter is available, which they can use for years and years. As to Sudan, I agree, flooding and the silt itself, more silt will be the deposit. The silt itself has become a big barrier for the Sudan. The silt will stay on the Ethiopian side, and more water will flow, according to the Ethiopian intellectuals researchers study. 10 billion metric cubic of due to evaporation that annually is lost will also be preserved. I mean, it's a win-win situation. And one final note, as you know, dear Lawrence, Ethiopia in a way literally is now armed Any military harm on the dam will also be very detrimental to the really downstream countries. So with this in mind, focusing back on Ethiopia, as we were discussing early on, I have come to know that you feel Ethiopia needs to build strong national institutions. Any thoughts and any comments on that?
Well, I think that I know there's a lot of contentiousness and going on in the country right now over certain actions that the Prime Minister, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, is taking. But for me, from my standpoint, one of the biggest dangers that Ethiopia faces is essentially an internal danger because of the strident ethnic nationalism that has divided the country for several decades. And this is not only harmful to the present situation, but this is a strategic vulnerability for the nation. Because if people have such a strong militant identification with their ethnicity, not to oppose its culture, but as considering their ethnicity the equivalent of a nation, this is very dangerous because nations develop as republics because there is a government that has accepted the responsibility for development of all its people. In the US Constitution, it's the general welfare concept that's in the preamble. And therefore, you need a government committed to the general welfare of all its people. And if you have a country that's divided into very, as I say, militant ethnic identities, then you don't have a nation state. You don't have a functioning republic. One of the things that I thought was positive about the Prime Minister when he first took office was the creation of a non-ethnic party, the Prosperity Party. And now he's taken other actions to form a national defense. Now, I know this is causing certain problems because of certain concerns in Amara in particular, but other parts of the nation that feel that they're not adequately protected, that the TPLF has not been adequately disarmed, that this could set up potential dangers for their people. And those are all relevant concerns for sure. But the idea of a national army is absolutely correct. You should not have competing military forces. That means you're not functioning as a nation. So these kinds of efforts, which are causing a little bit of unrest, nevertheless, are dealing with a major problem that the nation has because it's not equivalent to the United States. We have states with very limited power. Yes. The federal government has the majority of effective national policy, including the creation of credit, including a defense force. And this is what, if the Prime Minister is working in this direction, this is correct. We have to find a way, and I don't know how far the Dialogue Commission will go, but we really have to find a way to carry out a major educational campaign throughout the country where people understand the superiority of the notion of a citizen of a nation state or a republic, as opposed to believing that they are citizens of an ethnic grouping. So we are human beings, and human beings are defined by creativity of the mind. So you and I, and everyone else born is very much alike because we all have a creative mind, which no animal has. Our distinctions in terms of color and facial features and where we were born are not unimportant, but they're tertiary compared to the primary likeness, universal likeness, or universal similarity we have as creative species. And that's what has to be emphasized. Nations evolve to act upon and create the laws of the universe for the citizens of its nation. We form nations, we form governments in coherence with universal law. And universal law starts from the standpoint of the power of creativity of human beings. Ethnicity, ethnic nationalism opposes that. And we have to have a discussion at the highest philosophical levels to elevate the thinking of those people who consider ethnic identity their primary identity.
True, true. Well said. And going back to the USA, constitutionally, in the Constitution, it is defined. What's not stated in the Constitution is reserved for each and every American state. And on top of that, regarding defense, foreign policy, and currency, these are, rights and obligations, responsibilities reserved, on the other hand, for the federal government. There is one American Air Force, one American standing army, but the states have jurisdiction over local maintenance of law and order, that's policing, and then there is the National Guard, of course, in mighty America as well. Extending this question again, when we talk about, say, national institutions, I also believe a functioning and a very oiled civil service is also, I feel, a must, at least building up. What made Germany is this Prussian kind of, hierarchical efficiency, accountability, responsibility, and delivery of services. Any thoughts on that Ethiopia needing such kinds of a civil service, a functioning one?
Well, of course, if you go back in history, Ethiopia was not colonized because they defeated the Italian army in Adwa in 1896. But if you go look at your neighboring country, Sudan, Sudan, of course, was colonized by the British, and then the colonization was administered through Egypt for a time with the Anglo-Egyptian condominium.
Yep.
But one of the, in my discussions with some senior Sudanese officials many years ago, they said, well, the British left us two things that actually created the basis for nationalism in our nation. One was the civil service sector, and two was the army.
Okay.
Because these two institutions tend to nationalize a nation, give them institutions which supersede or transcend, maybe a better word, transcend the localities, the geographic localities, the various religious expressions, ethnic differences are transcended by national institutions. And these institutions must be built on a understanding of inclusion of the best people to perform the best jobs. In other words, you don't want a government that chooses someone because of where they came from, or who their ancestors were, or what their bloodline is. And in fact, what you're looking for is the opposite of what you see in the current division of Ethiopia into regional states that are dominated by one ethnic group or another. I mean, if you look at the role of ethnicity in all of Africa, I mean, we see it every 4 years in Kenya and in Nigeria, a country I know well, is people will vote not on the qualifications of the person and not on their policy, but on their ethnicity. If you're in the North, you're going to vote for a Hausa candidate. If you're in the South in Nigeria, you're going to vote for an Igbo candidate. So you're not voting on the thinking power of that candidate or the policy that candidate has for the future of your nation. You're voting for him or her based on their ethnicity. So the more national institutions we have, and of course the civil service sector and the army, the defense forces, are two areas where you must be ethnic blind. You cannot be concerned about ethnicity. You have to be concerned about getting the best qualified person to fill the job in the interest of the nation. What is the interest of my nation? What are my children going to do 20 years from now? Will they have jobs? Will they have homes with lighting so that the children can read and study and be intellectuals like you are? Will this be universal, that everybody has separate bedrooms and so that the children can read into the night and parents can have the leisure time to actually discuss policy for their country and meet with their friends and neighbors or go to town hall meetings and debate policy? Even if you debate it robustly, you have discussion of ideas. So what is the future of our nation 20, 40 years from now? That's what should be on the mind of every patriotic Ethiopian. And that excludes questions of ethnicity. It says, I am a member of the Ethiopian nation, and I must do what is necessary for my nation. And that's what the civil service is supposed to be. And the military, they swear allegiance to the nation, like the United States does. And they say, I am defending my nation at all times. I'm not defending my ethnic group.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me move on to my next question. And that is, what do you think would be the next phase of Ethiopia's development? Ethiopia is a rich country, huge populace. Of course, human resources itself is an asset if properly used. It's a strength itself, not a burden. Maybe now a burden, but the more we create jobs, the more this labor power can be used. Resources and everything Ethiopia has is rich, endowed. What do you think will be the next phase of Ethiopia's development? What should be? What's your comments regarding that?
Well, we're all now very happy as is the development of the GERD. And as you know, I think I discussed you last time, when the GERD is completed in 1 to 2 years, we should have a national holiday called GERD Day, just like Adwa Day. And I think that will also, the GERD will also help unify the country away from its divisions. But while we can be celebrating that, those of us with foresight, we have to be thinking about the future. Okay, the GERD is going to happen. I don't believe it'll be stopped. What do we do next? Where do we have to start planning for today? Well, the two things we need to concentrate on is agriculture and manufacturing. Now, the agricultural potential of Ethiopia is enormous, and very, very tiny, minuscule part is being used because you have cultivated land that is unused, and you have also total dependence on rainfall as your water source for your agriculture. We have to expand the arable land that is brought under cultivation. And then we have to expand the amount of land where we bring in irrigation. Now, irrigation, again, is electricity. It's infrastructure, because in many cases, you have to pump the water from one place to another. But this, together with using of fertilizers and mechanization, Ethiopia could become, and the whole continent of Africa could become a net exporting nation. I believe actually Ethiopia is going to be exporting some wheat this year. But the potential for agriculture is enormous. Manufacturing, Ethiopia has been leading the continent on light manufacturing, in particular in its industrial parks. Hawass is one of the larger ones. But we have to move to a robust manufacturing sector, because no nation can be sovereign and independent unless it has its own manufacturing sector. And this is the history of the world. I mean, the United States is a beautiful example under the leadership of Alexander Hamilton of creating a manufacturing sector against those who thought we should be exclusively agriculture. Without a manufacturing sector, guess what? You're dependent on buying all of your products, capital good products, manufactured products from the rest of the world at their terms of trade, at their prices. So actually not having a manufacturing sector is also a security problem. Now, Ethiopia has a very interesting capability. No one has discussed it. I'm the only one who's bringing it up. Is when one of my visits to Ethiopia, I think in 2021, I was given a several-hour tour of Ethiopian Airlines. Not only the planes, but also the whole area where they produce the engines, where they produce the planes, where they repair them. Now, this resembles to me what we would call in the advanced sector a machine tool capability. Machine tools are the machines that build the other machines for production. And the more advanced your technology is in your machine tool industry, then the more you're going to impact that machine tool design technology into the machines that it builds. Now, with the capability of Ethiopian Airlines, and I have beautiful pictures of this, you have the basis for building the machines for a manufacturing sector. Not every country has that because, for example, countries that depend on resource extraction like Nigeria never built up industry because actually resource extraction is not industrial. It doesn't create a lot of jobs and doesn't create capability. It brings in some revenue. So Ethiopia, I believe, can exploit the already intrinsic qualities of Ethiopian Airlines, which are growing and are huge. I mean, I looked at the amount of floor space and machine tool repair capability. This is the basis for nascent manufacturing machine tool sector, which most African countries don't have. And as you pointed out, you have over 100 million people and they're growing. And many in the West have accepted the zero growth mentality or neo-Malthusianism, where they think there's too many Africans. We should get rid of some of them. We don't need this many people. We don't need this many Black people. But they're obviously completely wrong. And they're not just racist, they're wrong because people are the source of wealth. All progress in civilization, going back to the discovery of fire 1 million years ago, we see on the campsites of South Africa. Mankind, through his creative powers, discovers physical laws or physical principles of the universe around him or her, the physical universe. We discover them. We don't discover all of them. We're in a process of perfection, which is a process of discovery. But every time we discover a principle, like gravity, for example, we can then use that to advance our technology for development. So there's a never-ending, self-perfecting, growing, unlimited process of development from the human race, and only by the human race. Animals can't do this. More people is potentially more creativity, is potentially more wealth. Wealth doesn't come from the land. It comes from the mind that utilizes the land. We created electricity, even though we've had a magnetic field around our planet for millions of years, billions of years. But we found out how to use that magnetic field. We found out how to use various resources. So more people, despite the Malthusian genocidalist anti-human faction, is always good. And but the question is a government wise enough to develop its capabilities to utilize those young minds that are coming in? And therefore, we have to master the use of credit. Credit is the key because it's not money. It's not what you got in your stock portfolio. It's issuing something for the future. We will give you a loan at very low interest rates because we're not interested in killing you with usury. But we insist that that loan be used to build something that will produce wealth in our economy. It's called the general welfare. So this credit, it has to be understood. I know Ethiopia now is trying to raise money, sell off part of Ethiopia.com and other things, but you have to understand the role of credit. And you've already established a model with the GERD, and we have to extend that model to building other necessary infrastructure, like railroads, which you're also doing. So Ethiopia is poised is poised for development. I just hope that the leaders understand these economic principles and apply them in the best possible manner.
Yes, very, very true. I think there is a discussion among the leadership, in the 10 years plan as well, import substitution, creating jobs at the local level. Talking about credit, a good point that you raise is microfinancing, single moms, small families, a couple of $1,000 will make a difference to start up, to buy a sewing machine or to do some, or to start something. And such kinds of things are now literally everywhere in Ethiopia. Plus, of course, decreasing dependencies of the economy from outside countries. Building one's own machine tools, one's own basic and I would say appropriate technologies as well. Appropriate technologies with the right education based on vocational education, and less so on this academia. That's the debate in Ethiopia right now, by the way. The Netherlands, the German experiment, the German type of education, and Netherlands type of education. So a lot is being discussed along with what we have discussed. So one has to stand on one's own feet, and one has to sweat and break one's back. No country can grow on the back of other countries and other peoples. Literally, the most part of the sweating should be done by us Ethiopians, I believe. Any comments on that?
Well, I think Dr. Brooks, you've already shown that. I mean, the fact that the Ethiopians funded almost $5 billion without taking any loans from the IMF or World Bank is a beautiful example of breaking the psychology that nations have to remain underdeveloped. This is you broke the equivalent of what we call in the West a glass ceiling. The African countries have to remain poor and they only subsist on aid, and we have to keep giving them aid. The US aid is very generous, but that's the wrong philosophy for the future of an economy. And Ethiopia has said, no, we will do it ourselves, and are doing it. I mean, this engineering scientific structure called the GERD, with employing 7,000 people, Ethiopians, is proof that it can be done. And it's broken through the mentality that African countries have to remain backward, have to remain underdeveloped, and have to basically depend on assistance from the outside. So the question is maintaining that, continuing that spirit, that boldness, that visionary attitude that the Ethiopians have over many governments. The GERD has existed over many governments. Actually, in this book, there's a great quote from Haile Selassie in 1960, saying, we don't have the ability to build a dam on the Blue Nile now, but we will in future generations. So this has been something that's gone on for decades in the thinking of Ethiopia, and now it's brought to fruition. Now the question is, do we have the leadership thinking about the future of Ethiopia in the terms that you and I are discussing now, in terms of advancing now to the next stage? We will continue to celebrate the GERD, but happiness doesn't rest in just one accomplishment. We have to now define new challenges and new accomplishments that Ethiopia must succeed. So we will have a stepping stone, one great accomplishment after another. And we have to always be thinking about the future while we're very happy about what we're doing in the present.
Very true. Let me take you remind me of another factor or another variable, and that's migration. Lots of our African brothers and sisters, they migrate, even as far as West Africa, Senegal, Mali, take the risk to go to the Mediterranean, either northwest or northeast via Lampedusa, Italy, in Libya, and even Ethiopians go to Saudi Arabia, Yemen, via Somalia, Somaliland, Bosaso, Garawe, excuse me, such ports via Djibouti. There is a precedence and a history in other countries in Latin America and even in America. These countries like Africa, where people flee from their country in search of a better tomorrow. Even Russians, the Irish, President Joe Biden is in Ireland now for a 4-day visit, as you know. His Irish ancestors, millions of them came to America. The British, the Scots, the Germans and Russians and even the Ethiopian diaspora, for economic primarily and secondary political reasons. Research shows us that migration, even number of illegal migrants, will go down, provided there is a dynamism of economic and social growth within one's country. Let's say, God willing, if we could achieve that in the next 10, 15, 20 countries. Any comments on that, Dr. Freeman?
Now, there are also, in addition to the migration patterns that you mentioned, there's been indications that some of the Africans are even taking boats across the Atlantic and to Latin America, South America, Ibero-America. So this is very dangerous. And it shows the desperation. You read stories about people who have tried to make it to Italy and have died in the process. And their siblings, in one case, a brother says, I know my brother died doing this, but I'm nevertheless going to try it. Now, why would people risk their physical existence to do this? Is because of the desperation they feel at home. Now, again, this is a real blind spot for the United States and the West. Really, they don't want to address this problem at all. Because if, for example, you take the Sahel, now this project that I've been working on, Transaqua, this would transform the economies of the Congo, the DRC, but then the whole Lake Chad Basin, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, Central African Republic in this project would be transformed into a major center of economic activity. Because the idea is to build a canal taking a small percentage of water from the Congo River, and it would go through Bangui, the capital of Central African Republic, because the water would link up to the river Chari. And because the Chari releases its water into Lake Chad, and you would be a flow of maybe 50 billion cubic meters of water or more annually coming from the Congo River. So this would transform that area. And this project was proposed 40 years ago. Wow. Now, why do we spend the money? Whatever, 10, 20, 30, 50, 60 billion dollars. We have spent trillions of dollars on the so-called counterterrorism force in the Sahel, and USAID combined is over $1 trillion. And what have we accomplished? Nothing. The Sahel is more dangerous today than it was 10 years ago. Of course, this was aided by the Obama administration in their idiocy of overthrowing Gaddafi. So if you want to stop migration, the same thing in the United States on our southern border. If you want to stop migration, build economies where people would rather stay there than risk their lives. And this can be done for the same or less money that we're now spending on so-called counterterrorism training and other military actions in the Sahel. So this is a real deficiency in the West thinking. Now, some people may intentionally be trying to do this, and others may just be ignorant. The only support from the West that we got for our Transaqua project, which was taken up by the government of President Buhari, just wasn't implemented, unfortunately. And the water minister, Suleiman Adamu, still talks about it, even though they're now on their way out as a government. But the only Western country that had any support for this was Italy. Italy was willing to put up €1.5 million to help fund the feasibility study. So why did they do this? Because they were receiving the bulk of these immigrants coming in from Northern Africa.
Italy,
But if the whole West and the United States had gotten behind this for a mere millions of dollars on feasibility studies that would lead then into billions of dollars of construction, this would be valuable money spent that would transform approximately 12 countries, approximately a third of the African continent would be transformed by this project. And we in the West are so stupid that we don't know how to spend our money because we're no longer include development as part of our foreign policy. We have aid, but not development. And this is true at the African Summit that just took place last December in Washington, the US-African Summit. And nothing has changed with all these visits to Africa. We want to counter China. That's number one reason for it, because China is our number one enemy, according to the Biden administration. But we're not offering anything that's going to lead to any change. And that's the sad part.
Interesting, quite interesting, quite interesting. And going back to, water is life, and Africa, there is a pressure on the land. Population is now 1.4 billion people. That's equivalent to India. India is already moving closer to China, and India is about to, in the coming 2 years or 3 years, going to buy. It's not a competition, by the way, but it's going to be number one. And mind you, it means every year, Africa, Ethiopia, the 54, 55 countries of Africa have more and more and more mouths to feed. And that has to be, this is a challenge, I believe, and water is life. And if we could realize such kinds of bold and necessary projects, timely projects, I believe, because if we build it now, it might cost 1 billion or 10 billion. But if we build it 20 years from now, it's going to cost 50 or 60 billion. And then it's going to be, Africa will have not 1.4 billion people, but 2.0 billion or something. So sometimes being late, as the saying goes, whoever comes late will be penalized in a way. And that is might be the reality. We have one planet, the blue planet, and too many holes. All of us would, it's going to be detrimental to our existence. But the more we rich or poor, developed or developing, do something, the more we'll help each other out and maintain our well-being and existence and guarantee our existence for the futures to come. The way if you ask me, the way I see it. So what will be the future of Africa? Given the current here and there lack of political peace and stability, I'm asking a general continental question. Given the population pressure, given the lack of capital, yes, there are some countries like Ghana and Ethiopia and other countries in the south as well. A few are progressing very well. I mean, Ethiopia is not like Angola. We don't have an oil, but now our economy is going to surpass Angola's, believe it or not, shortly. Ethiopia, yes, the facts tell us that. And Ethiopia has passed last year and a half or 2 years Kenya, which is the center of East Africa. But the Kenyans started way, way back when it comes to free market economy, so to speak, to develop in a very broad way. But now Ethiopia is trying to catch up. So there is this coming up and going down even in Africa. Given this bitter reality about resource mobilization, capital mobilization, and uneven nature of the distribution of resources, finance, and land and minerals, what do you think will be the future of Africa in the next 20 years or so? Looking at your crystal ball, so to speak, as an intellectual and as a knowledgeable person who has traveled a lot and written a lot about African continent.
We have, any strategic thinker who's looking at the world clearly now knows that the African continent is and will increasingly become the most important part of this century's political economic future. As you pointed out, the expectation is projection for population growth is almost 2.5 billion by 2050.
Mhm.
1 billion young people, the largest collective workforce in the world. And in fact, some projections, some articles indicate that Western nations, including my own United States, will be importing labor from Africa because we don't reproduce so quickly over here.
Oh, yeah.
So the African continent is at the center right now.
Mhm.
So what do we have to do? Well, the biggest thing hurting Africa is not the resources, are all there. Even the water is there. I mean, the Sahel and the Sahara we have to deal with, but they can be dealt with. The problem is we have to have a full commitment for a visionary program for the infrastructure development of the African continent.
Mhm.
Energy is essential.
Yeah.
My back of the envelope projection is we need over 1,000 gigawatts of power in Africa. And I would suggest an increasing percentage of that be nuclear energy. We need a high-speed rail network. And we can't wait to 2063, which is what the African Union Agenda 2063 is.
Yeah.
We need major roads. We need major hospitals. None of this is possible without electricity.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no shortage of wealth on the continent. The question is we have to industrialize African nations. Again, electricity. Again, infrastructure. Industrialized nations do better on every facet, including resisting changes in the climate. If you're industrialized, your housing is better, your quality of life is better.
Yep.
We have to think about Africa as a resource for the future of the planet, and also a resource in terms of minds of new young people, because Africa will have 1/4 of the population of the planet as it's projected at the moment. Now, that's going to require, we have to have a change in our economic financial system.
Mm-hmm.
And what I know and others do as well is that the Western system right now is no longer dominant in the world. This thing called the new, it's called the rules-based international order, is a fraud. It's just a name for the old geopolitical financial system. That rules-based international order that Biden and Blinken and so many people talk about is no longer functioning. And China is emerging, will emerge as the #1 economy, despite the US saying no. Russia has already shown it doesn't adhere to the US Western dictates. Other countries, India, the whole BRICS movement, Brazil with the new president, Modi in India, and others are working towards a different conception called the BRICS represents a paradigm for new development. Of course, it's driven by China. Now, this is something that the African leaders can take advantage of. They should no longer look to be beholden to the IMF and World Bank. They have to move away from begging to those institutions. We should have new financial institutions, national banks. And I was working with a group of Africans to create an African Infrastructure Development Bank. Capitalize these banks, restrict the loans to projects that lead to an increase in the infrastructure investment. Work with China, work with Russia, work with India, work with Turkey, work with other nations, Japan, and those allies who are committed to the development. And we have to evolve into a new political economic system, a new paradigm, away from the rules-based order, away from the IMF and World Bank, where this combination of countries work together for their shared common interests, and which is centered on a paradigm of development. That conception has to be what drives the leadership of the African countries, because the world is changing. The West is not going to dominate forever. The West should participate in a new paradigm of development. It should, and hopefully it will, but the rules-based order in the IMF World Bank system can no longer hold back and dominate the world. And that is now, it's clear to me as I read American media and study my government and look around the world, This system is now set to change.
Yeah.
It's not in control. And we have to be smart enough to realize how we can form a new coalition of countries that operate on a different system, away from financial manipulation and exploitation to development. Thank you very much.
Good. One point regarding the question, a follow-up question is, Africans are known for their wisdom. Africans are also known for not putting all their eggs in one bag. The same for Ethiopians, I believe. Yes, there are powers now emerging, China, Russia, Turkey, etc., etc. But for those who write and who predict, let's say, the downfall of the West or the weakening of the West, I don't think, as a political scientist and political philosophy and the media sciences, that has already been projected and predicted for literally before the First World War, in between the Second World War, and after the Second World War. Still, the West is still alive and kicking. Yes, new powers and new actors are emerging on the stage in world political hierarchy and the world stage. So wouldn't it be short-sighted to say that the West will be weak and move away, because still the economy is still dynamic? Yes, we can question whether wealth is distributed fairly or unfairly in the West, but still the system is functioning. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't want to see the downfall of my own country, the United States. I love this country. I love the principles it was founded on. I'm not so pleased with the current governments. But the fact of the matter is the system, the financial system, where you have Wall Street and the City of London controlling prices, where you have a financial system that has almost $2 trillion in derivatives, which are pure gambling, speculation, bets. That has filled up the Western financial system. The Bretton Woods system that Roosevelt created with Dexter White in 1944 doesn't function anymore. There's no long-term low-interest loans that come out of the IMF and the World Bank. The Wall Street crowd in the United States virtually owns the US government. So this system, this financial system, this mentality, and this mentality of what they call the rules-based international order, that we determine the rules. We will decide how you will become democratic. We will define democratic, which I don't agree with even their definition of it. We will be ordering and telling countries what to do. This system, what I call geopolitical or an oligarchical system, has to be broken apart. Not the countries, but the system. And we have to emerge to a better system. Why not have respect for all sovereign nations? There is a fundamental common interest that unites every single nation. And it goes back to what we discussed at the beginning of our interview. The human being. Every human being is equal in its potential for creativity. Therefore, every nation has the same responsibility to develop and nurture its people, its citizens. Therefore, every nation has the same foreign policy, which is the policy is working with other nations for the development of their people. So there are no intrinsic divisions. There is only the potential of unity. Unity based on the fact that we are all nations, and nations are made up of people. And the needs of the people and the interests of the people are precisely the same. We have different languages, we have different cultures, we have different capabilities. All that should be respected. But we need to have a new paradigm, which is not interested in exploitation, which is not interested in paper profits, financial manipulation, control of prices, control of trade, but actually thinks about the interest of other nations. The interest of the other is an interest to thyself, to quote this Treaty of Westphalia from
Yeah.
1648. So you take this Transact principle.
Yeah.
The fact that the West refused to even acknowledge it. I'm the only person in the United States that knows about this thing and is considered an expert on the subject practically. I've been called in to speak to people in private in our government about this. But why isn't this a massive support from the West? Why hasn't there been one letter or speech by either Secretary of State Blinken or President Joe Biden on the importance and significance of Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam? Because they're not thinking clearly. They don't understand the importance of this dam. They're not really thinking about how to develop Ethiopia. So we need a new system, a new paradigm, which actually thinks about how to expand, develop, enrich the human race. This system, the so-called rules-based international order, does not. And therefore, it's a system that has to be changed and replaced, not the downfall of any nation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your ideas. It's a free discussion. I'll call it an academic discussion as well. Thank you for that. You know what you remind me of? I consider myself a lucky guy, as one says in America. Recently, I interviewed a Soviet cosmonaut who paid a visit to Ethiopia. He was in the International Space Station with a Japanese and with an American astronaut as well. He spent 6 months in space. And one of the questions, my dear Lawrence, that I asked him was, how do you feel when you look at this blue planet from space, this vulnerable one dot? And he was very thoughtful. I asked him thousands of suns and galaxies. We have not yet finished our discoveries, And he was very thoughtful and said, Professor, I don't see any borders, he said, from afar. No borders, political borders. And that was really the wisdom. And it's going to be aired, I think, this coming Saturday. We had a great conversation. And that's what you remind me of. At the end of the day, we live in one vulnerable blue planet. Too much holes, as I said already, then on us, all of us would lose reach for poor. So, Dr. Lawrance Freeman, thank you for your time. Really, I'll give you the last word if you have anything to say to wrap up by taking a couple of minutes. Yes,
I think that we're at a potential point of change on the planet. And I think that, as I mentioned, the weakening of this current exploitive system is apparent. And I think that Africa is going to play a significant role in how the entire human race moves forward. And we have to be thinking now about how to utilize our resources, especially our resources of human beings. Because if we don't, the situation will actually get far, far worse. So the future of Africa depends not on a crystal ball, it depends on what we do. And those of us who know what to do and those of us who care, we should be working together for the development of this continent, which has really been kept under development since the history of mankind. And now is the time to break that. And that's something that I look forward to helping and consulting and discussing with my friends in Africa and in the United States over the days and weeks ahead.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence. It was a joy to have you once again. And we hope to see you once again soon back to Addis, hopefully, if not still in the African continent, somewhere in the African continent. And we'll continue the conversations. So thank you for your time. And I would like to thank you on behalf of myself as the producer and director of the Voice of the Diaspora of Now TV, my colleagues and the staff, and also our audience here in America, as well as we are watched by satellite literally everywhere, even in America, and also using the social media. If somebody misses your interview, thanks again. I hope to see you soon. So, ladies and gentlemen, this was our today's session program with a professor as well as a Dr. Lawrence Freeman. He's a connoisseur, a researcher on Africa. Until I see you next time, I take leave of you. I say au revoir. Wish you a happy Easter and a happy Ethiopian Fasika. And Good Friday as well, and happy Easter. And to our Muslim brothers and sisters as well, they are about to finish in the coming next week. They're fasting. I also wish our brothers and sisters, Ethiopians and everywhere Muslims around the world, happy Ramadan. Until I see you with another guest in my next program, it's me, Brooke Hailu, nahootv, Voice of the Diaspora. I take leave. Au revoir. Wassalam koyun. Thank you for watching us, and keep on watching.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brooks. Hope to see you soon.
My pleasure. My pleasure.